Look, I'm all for giving people a shot, but let's be honest. She wasn't brought on because she's the best. They just needed the numbers. You can hear it every time she talks in stand-up, completely lost. We're going to end up carrying her for months. I don't even know how she made it through the interview.
Your mic is on. Everyone can hear you.
Oh.
Thomas Griffin sat in his upscale home office that Tuesday afternoon in June 2023, an energy drink fizzing beside him on the glass-top desk. Eyes hard and narrowed as 320 avatars loaded into the Zoom grid on his screen. He had absolutely no idea that in exactly 22 minutes, his life as he knew it would be over. Not because of a market crash, not because of a medical crisis, but because of 58 seconds of words he was 100% certain no living soul could hear. 58 seconds that would cost him a $650,000 salary. A reputation constructed across a decade of calculated climbing, and every professional door he had ever walked through, all of it, sealed shut before the afternoon was through. If you are ready to see institutional racism taken down, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of cops messing with the wrong people and finding out. Let's continue. Let's go back to that Tuesday afternoon in June 2023. CloudForge Digital was a mid-sized technology firm headquartered in Austin, Texas, with just over 400 employees spread across 3 time zones. The company had built its name on enterprise software solutions, but in the past 2 years, its crown jewel, an AI-driven project management tool called Forge, had quietly become the product that investors, clients, and industry analysts all watched most closely. Forge was sophisticated, adaptive, and quietly revolutionary. The company's leadership knew it represented their best chance at breaking into the upper tier of enterprise tech. What they did not fully know yet was who was really responsible for building it. Thomas Griffin had been a senior technology manager at CloudForge for 6 years. At 41, he had cultivated the kind of career that looked immaculate from the outside. Fast promotions, glowing performance reviews, the trust of executives who saw in him a man who delivered results. His compensation reflected that trust. $650,000 annually, inclusive of base salary, bonuses, and equity, had afforded him a penthouse condominium in downtown Austin, a matte black Range Rover in the underground garage, and a wardrobe that leaned expensive without advertising it. He had made it by any conventional measurement, and he knew it, and that knowledge had slowly curdled into entitlement over the years. The source of that entitlement wore a specific shape by June 2023. It had been forming quietly, resentfully, for 2 years, ever since a woman named Sarah had joined his team. Sarah was 34, soft-spoken and methodical in a way that read to Thomas as slowness, though it was anything but. She had joined CloudForge's AI development division as a senior engineer, arriving with credentials Thomas had privately dismissed from the moment he saw her onboarding file. He had made up his mind before she spoke a word in her first team meeting, had decided, in the way that bias often operates through the architecture of assumption rather than evidence, that she did not belong there on merit. She was, in his private assessment, a product of diversity pressures, a box checked by an HR department, anxious to improve its demographic optics. The fact that her work consistently challenged that narrative did not update his view. It only deepened his irritation. What Thomas did not see, what he had systematically arranged not to see, was the full picture of who Sarah was. She managed type 1 diabetes with the kind of quiet discipline that most people never witness. Insulin pen tucked into her desk drawer, glucose monitor checked discreetly between meetings, late nights at her keyboard fueled less by stimulants and more by a structured ferocity that expressed itself only in output. She rarely spoke first in meetings. She rarely pushed back on decisions that dismissed her suggestions. She absorbed the microaggressions, the slight pause before her name was called, the way her contributions in group documents somehow surfaced later under other people's names, the promotions she was informally encouraged to apply for and then passed over, twice, without explanation. She absorbed all of it, and she kept working, and she said almost nothing. Thomas had taken that silence for confirmation. The June all-hands meeting had been called by CloudForge's executive leadership in response to a crisis that had been building for 3 months. Forge, the AI tool that anchored the company's growth projections, had stalled. A critical deployment to a cluster of enterprise clients had been delayed by repeated technical failures. Clients were beginning to send pointed emails. The board had questions. The internal pressure was substantial, and leadership had convened the company-wide Zoom, 320 employees, every team, every time zone, to address it directly and publicly in the spirit of transparency that the company's culture deck championed. Thomas joined the call at 2:58 in the afternoon. He positioned himself in front of his ring light, checked his background, the curated bookshelf, the framed industry award, and settled into his chair with the ease of a man who had sat in important meetings for years and never once felt that one of them might end his career. The host opened proceedings at 3 o'clock precisely. The agenda was familiar. Project status updates, accountability review, a forward-looking action plan, standard corporate choreography. But beneath the structured surface, the meeting carried a tension that everyone could feel, the specific discomfort of an organization trying to perform composure while managing quiet panic. Thomas kept his expression neutral. Internally, he was already assigning blame, and his eyes kept drifting to the small avatar in the lower quadrant of his screen. Sarah, camera on, sitting at what he knew was the modest desk in her apartment, composed and attentive as always in a way that he found, for reasons he never examined closely, profoundly aggravating. When the discussion turned to the Forge deployment failures, the executive leading the review invited team leads to weigh in. The room, virtual as it was, tightened. Careers were being quietly assessed in real time, and everyone knew it. Sarah unmuted herself. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. Her suggestion was precise. A specific recalibration of the model's training parameters that, she proposed, had been overlooked during the last integration cycle, and which she believed was the root cause of the client-facing failures. Her language was technical, specific, and confident in the restrained way of someone who knows exactly what they are talking about and has no need to perform certainty. Several participants in the chat began typing immediately, engineers recognizing the logic, nodding at their screens in apartments across 3 time zones. Thomas heard none of it. What he processed was the audacity of the suggestion, her suggestion, being received with what looked dangerously like respect by the executives on the call. His jaw tightened. 2 years of managed disdain pressed against the back of his composure, like water behind a dam. He reached for his phone. He had a college friend he called when he needed to vent. Someone outside the industry. Someone who would listen without professional consequence. He tapped the contact without looking, eyes still on the Zoom grid, and raised the phone to his ear as the call connected. Or, rather, as he assumed it connected. His friend did not pick up. The line rang out. Thomas lowered the phone, glanced at the screen, and in that distracted, frustrated moment, did not look at his laptop, did not notice the small green microphone icon in the corner of his Zoom interface, glowing steadily. Unmuted, as it had been since he opened the call, he began to mutter. Low at first, the way a man talks to himself in an empty room, the words loose and unguarded in the way that private speech always is. He questioned the meeting, he questioned the direction. And then, as his resentment found its rhythm, he stopped being indirect. He said her name. He reached for the words he had kept private for 2 years, the taxonomy of his contempt, Diabetic Black Quota Hire, assembled them into a sentence, and delivered his verdict on her ideas, her qualifications, and her presence on his team with the full, casual certainty of a man who believed completely that he was alone. He was not alone. 320 people heard every word. The chat exploded first. A cascade of messages that scrolled so fast, the sidebar became a blur. Then came the silence from the speakers, the specific, loaded silence of hundreds of people holding their breath simultaneously. And then clear and cutting through the stillness, a colleague's voice, unmuted somewhere in the grid. Those 4 words that landed like a hand on Thomas's shoulder in a dark room. "Thomas, your mic's hot." He looked at his screen, the green icon, the chat, the faces, some frozen, some wide-eyed, some already looking away with the discomfort of witnesses. Thomas Griffin sat very still in his expensive chair, in his carefully curated home office, and understood, in the space of a single breath, what he had done. The host ended the meeting 30 seconds later. 320 screens went dark. Thomas's laptop sat open in front of him, quiet now. The Zoom window closed, the damage already permanent, already spreading, already irreversible, filed on a server that recorded every company-wide meeting as standard practice. His phone began to vibrate. The screen had been dark for less than 4 minutes when the first notification arrived. Then the second. Then in the way that professional catastrophe accelerates once it begins. They came without pause. Messages from numbers he recognized and numbers he did not, piling into his phone with the momentum of something that had already escaped containment. Thomas Griffin sat motionless in his home office, energy drink untouched and warm beside him, staring at the closed laptop as though the act of not reopening it might suspend what was already in motion. His hands, resting on the desk, were trembling in the precise, fine-grained way of a man whose nervous system has registered a threat before his conscious mind has fully processed it. The afternoon light through the window was unchanged, still gold, still calm, the city below him indifferent. But the room felt different, smaller somehow. The framed award on the bookshelf behind him, the curated backdrop of a decade's success, had already begun to feel like props from a production that had just been canceled. His work phone rang. The caller identification read, "Human Resources, Internal." He answered. The voice on the other end was measured and brief. He was being summoned to an immediate meeting, private Zoom link, already sent to his corporate email, to begin in 15 minutes. HR leadership, legal counsel, 2 senior executives. He was advised to join promptly. The call ended before he could respond. He opened his laptop. He found the link. He clicked it at the designated time, with the punctuality of a man who had not yet located a viable alternative. The call that awaited him bore no resemblance to the one he had just derailed. There was no grid of avatars, no ambient typing, no sense of collective energy. There were 5 faces arranged in a clean row. The head of human resources, a company attorney whose expression communicated nothing, and 3 executives, including the chief executive officer, who said nothing at all for the first 2 minutes, and whose silence was the most precise articulation of consequence that Thomas had ever encountered. The HR director opened the session by informing Thomas that the company-wide meeting had been recorded, as per standard policy, a policy Thomas had known about, had acknowledged in writing annually. The recording had been reviewed. Specific timestamps had been isolated. He would now hear a portion of what had been captured. They played it back to him. 41 seconds of audio. His own voice, relaxed, unguarded, delivered with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed himself invisible, filling the speakers of a meeting room in which no one laughed and no one looked away. Thomas began to speak. He said he had believed himself muted. He said the words had been venting, stress-related, never intended to be heard. He said he respected his team. He said the clip, without context, could be misread. The attorney interrupted once quietly to note that the recording was unambiguous and that Thomas had been informed the meeting was being recorded. The HR director, noted that the incident, as captured, constituted a violation of the company's conduct policy, its anti-discrimination framework, and its hostile work environment standards, and that 318 employees, in addition to the executive leadership present, had been direct witnesses in real time. Thomas's defenses did not crumble dramatically. They simply became insufficient one by one, and the room, quiet, professional, utterly unmoved, let them fail without ceremony. His employment was terminated effective immediately. His system access had already been revoked at the network level during the preceding 15 minutes. He would receive a severance package, minimal, as the attorney confirmed, given the conduct-based nature of the termination, and a formal separation agreement would arrive via courier and email within 24 hours. He was asked to confirm his home address for the courier. He confirmed it. The call ended. $650,000 a year. The Range Rover in the garage, the penthouse view, the industry reputation, the equity vesting in 8 months. All of it separated from him in a conversation that had lasted 23 minutes. Across the city, in an apartment that Thomas Griffin had never visited and had never thought to wonder about, Sarah sat at her modest desk in the hour after the meeting ended. Her second monitor displayed a sequence of project files she had been annotating before the call, and she had not yet closed them, though she was no longer reading them. Her phone sat face up beside her keyboard. Messages had come from colleagues, carefully worded, some uncertain in their solidarity, a few bracingly direct, and she had read each one without immediately responding. She had spent 2 years in the particular exhaustion of someone who absorbs daily indignity as a condition of employment. The private email she had seen, forwarded to her by a colleague with a conscience, emails in which Thomas had characterized her suggestions as derivative and her presence on the team as a concession to optics. The promotion cycles in which she had been encouraged to apply and then quietly passed over, while the feedback delivered to her cited vague concerns about leadership readiness. The times her technical contributions had appeared in presentations under the collective byline of the team, her specific authorship dissolved into the group. She had documented all of it, methodically, in a folder she had kept updated for 14 months, unsure whether she would ever need it. She was beginning to think she might need it soon. Pause here for just a moment, because this is one of those stories that makes you ask yourself something real. Have you ever witnessed a workplace moment where the mask came off, where bias that everyone had suspected finally stepped into the open? Drop a yes or no in the comments. And if this story is resonating with you, share it. These conversations matter beyond the screen. Thomas, meanwhile, was discovering what professional erasure feels like in real time. His corporate email returned an auto-reply. Account deactivated. The internal project platform rejected his credentials. A colleague he had known for 4 years responded to his text with a message so brief it communicated everything. Others did not respond at all. He opened LinkedIn and scrolled his own profile, the endorsements, the career timeline, the carefully maintained digital architecture of a decade, and understood, in a way he had not understood during the termination call, that the recording existed outside the company's firewall, that it had likely already been shared, that the tech industry in Austin was not large, and that the people who mattered within it had become evening without his noticing, and the penthouse sat around him in expensive silence, the award on the bookshelf, catching the last of the fading light. Thomas Griffin, at 41 years old, at the peak of a career he had spent a decade constructing, sat alone in a room full of things that had already stopped meaning what they used to mean, and began, for the first time, to account for the distance between who he had believed himself to be and what the recording had confirmed. By 8 o'clock that evening, CloudForge Digital's executive floor, remote and distributed as it was, scattered across home offices and hotel rooms and a single, glass-walled corner office in the Austin headquarters, had been in continuous emergency session for 4 hours. The damage control calculus was complicated. 318 employees had been direct witnesses to an event that had no clean internal resolution. The recording existed. The words were documented. HR had acted swiftly and correctly. But the company still faced the compound problem of a delayed AI deployment, a workforce processing collective shock, and a senior management team that had now lost one of its most visible technology leads. A man who had, by all external measures, been central to the Forge project's development. That last assumption was about to be revised. The follow-up internal forum convened at 9:15 that evening, a smaller, quieter gathering than the afternoon's catastrophe, restricted to department heads, executive leadership, and senior engineers. It was framed as a stabilization session, an opportunity to address the team, confirm the day's decisions, and chart an immediate path forward on the Forge deployment crisis. The host opened the call, acknowledged the afternoon's events with measured gravity, and invited any senior technical staff who wished to speak to unmute. For a long moment, no one did. Then Sarah's name appeared in the participant list, unmuted. She had not spoken in a company forum at this level before. She had offered technical input in team meetings, had submitted detailed written recommendations through the proper channels, had once presented to a mid-tier executive audience on a narrow feature rollout. She had never addressed the full senior leadership cohort directly. The room, what passed for a room, in the distributed architecture of remote work, waited. What followed was methodical. It was delivered without theater and without urgency, in the same precise, restrained register she used when she was entirely certain of her ground. She informed the assembled leadership that she needed to disclose something that was directly relevant to both the Forge deployment crisis and to the events of that afternoon. She asked for 20 minutes. She was given them. Over those 20 minutes, Sarah dismantled the foundational assumption that Thomas Griffin had built his position upon. She was not, she confirmed, simply a senior engineer who had worked within the Forge project's development cycle. She was under a pseudonym she had maintained since the project's earliest architecture phase, its primary creator. The core algorithm, the adaptive learning framework that made Forge genuinely distinctive in its market category, the component that analysts and investors pointed to when they described the product's potential, had been built by her. Developed after hours, prototyped on her personal equipment, and introduced into the company's development environment under a technical alias. She had registered through a project contributor system that CloudForge had implemented 18 months prior, precisely to allow anonymous contribution and reduce the evaluative bias that the company's own internal research had identified as a barrier to innovation. She had chosen anonymity deliberately. She had understood, with the clarity that comes from 2 years of observed experience, that work bearing her name was processed through a particular filter, assessed first through the assumptions Thomas carried and communicated, and only afterward evaluated on its technical merits, if evaluated at all. Work submitted, without her name attached, moved differently. It was read, debated, refined, integrated. The algorithm had been integrated fully into Forge's core architecture 11 months ago, had been credited in internal documentation to the pseudonymous contributor account, and had since become the engine on which the product's client deployments ran. She had brought documentation, commit logs, time-stamped development records, the original architecture files with their authorship metadata, and the detail that landed with the particular weight of finality. A sequence of internal emails forwarded to her by a colleague, in which Thomas Griffin had attempted on 3 separate occasions to have the pseudonymous contributor account flagged for review, and the associated code submissions deprioritized, citing unverifiable sourcing. He had not known who the contributor was. He had simply recognized that the work was being received as significant and had moved to obstruct it. He had failed, because the code had been reviewed independently by a technical lead who reported to a different management chain and had been approved on its merits. Thomas's objections had been noted, routed to a lower priority review queue, and eventually closed without action. The executive leadership listened without interruption. When Sarah finished, the chief executive officer asked 3 technical clarifying questions. The chief technology officer asked 2. A senior architect on the call, who had worked with the pseudonymous account's code contributions for months, confirmed the technical account. Without hesitation, he recognized the architectural signature. He had always found it remarkable. The company did not deliberate for long. By 10:45 that evening, Sarah had been offered and had accepted an interim director of AI architecture position, effective the following morning, with a formal compensation revision to follow within 30 days. She was also designated as technical lead on the Forge deployment recovery. The crisis that had precipitated the afternoon's meeting, now assigned to the person most precisely qualified to resolve it. She returned to her desk in her apartment. The second monitor still displayed the project files she had been annotating before the day began. She closed them because she now had different files to open, ones that bore her name. In the penthouse across the city, Thomas learned what had happened the way he was learning everything now, through the margins. A former colleague, guilty and uncertain, sent a text that described only the broad shape of the revelation. He searched his own memory for the pseudonymous contributor account, and found it, like a splinter he had been trying to locate for months, the code submissions he had flagged, the work he had attempted to stall without knowing whose it was. The understanding arrived the way the worst understandings do, not as a single blow, but as a sequence of recognitions, each one confirming the dimension of the one before it. The woman he had dismissed as a diversity hire had built the product his career had been taking credit for managing. The algorithm he had presented to clients, referenced in performance reviews and positioned as evidence of his team's capability, had been created by her, anonymously, because she had known correctly that attribution would not protect the work. He had tried to suppress even that. By the following morning, the story had reached the industry. Not loudly. There were no press releases, no public statements, but through the specific channels by which professional reputation travels in tight-knit sectors. A LinkedIn post from a CloudForge engineer, carefully worded. A thread in a private tech Slack group with 400 members. A brief mention in an industry newsletter that covered Austin's tech ecosystem. Thomas Griffin's name appeared in each of these contexts with the particular permanence of the documented record. He had said what he had said. It was on file. The industry knew. The Range Rover sat in the underground garage. The penthouse was quiet. The career that had taken 10 years to build had taken 23 minutes to dismantle, with 58 seconds of audio as the instrument of its destruction. What the story left behind was not simply the spectacle of a fall. It was a more uncomfortable accounting of how many rooms Thomas Griffin had walked into and been given authority that he had not generated on his own merits, of how much work had flowed through his team, had been absorbed by his performance narrative, had carried him upward, work that had originated with a woman he had dismissed before she finished her first sentence, of how long that arrangement had held, because the woman it depended on had chosen, for reasons of survival, not to sign her own name. Sarah had understood something that Thomas never had, that in environments shaped by the assumptions he carried, anonymity was not defeat. It was strategy. It was the method by which the work could be evaluated on what it actually was, free from the tax imposed by bias, allowed to demonstrate its worth before the filter of prejudice could diminish it. She had endured, she had documented, she had waited, and in the end the truth had not required her to raise her voice. It had only required the space to be seen clearly. And a Tuesday afternoon in June, when someone else's carelessness burned every obstruction in the room to the ground. The lesson Thomas Griffin was left with, alone in his expensive apartment in the weeks that followed, as the severance negotiations dragged, as the recruiter calls stopped, as the professional network that had once opened doors went quiet, was not complicated. It was, in fact, the simplest possible lesson that a man in his position could be taught. The people you underestimate are always keeping score, and if you're watching this and thinking about the Zoom call you have tomorrow morning, check your mic, check it twice. But more than that, examine what you'd say if you believed no one could hear you, because that is who you actually are. And the recording is always running. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your thoughts in the comments below.